252 million years ago, the world's oceans were not like ours. They were a sprawling, alien kingdom. Strange reefs built by unfamiliar creatures filtered the water, and bizarre predators ruled the food chains. But then, from the heart of Siberia, the Earth's crust split open. It unleashed a cataclysm that would suffocate the entire ocean, wiping out over 95% of all marine life. The seas died. And for millions of years, they stayed dead. Why? And in that toxic water, how did anything claw its way back to rebuild life on Earth? This was the end of an era. The Paleozoic. A time before dinosaurs, when life had experimented for hundreds of millions of years. The oceans of the late Permian were perhaps the most ecologically complex the world had ever seen. Forget the coral reefs we know today. These ancient seas were dominated by vast, intricate structures. Built by creatures called brachiopods and delicate plant-like crinoids. They were massive, sprawling cities of life, filtering the warm, ancient water. And in these cities, the citizens were wonderfully strange. The last of the trilobites. These iconic, armored arthropods were nearing the end of their long reign. They skittered across the seafloor, a dynasty 270 million years in the making. Alongside them, giant sea scorpions, the eurypterids, hunted with terrifying claws. This ecosystem was stable, ancient, and incredibly successful. The food webs were intricate. The biodiversity was staggering. Life had achieved a balance, a rich tapestry of predators and prey, builders and scavengers. It seemed, after so long, that this world was permanent. It felt like it would last forever. But it was all built on a foundation that was about to shatter. Then, the world cracked open. In what is now Siberia, a plume of magma the size of a continent burned its way through the Earth's crust. This was not a volcano. It was a flood of lava covering an area larger than Western Europe. For nearly 1 million years, the Siberian Traps bled fire and gas, relentlessly pumping the atmosphere full of carbon dioxide. The air grew thick. The globe began to heat, rapidly. The first rains that fell were not water. They were torrents of acid, dissolving the forests and scouring the land. And all of this, all of it, was just the beginning. The real killer was already at work in the sea. The oceans, which had absorbed perhaps half of this atmospheric CO2, began to fundamentally change. They became acidic. For the creatures that built the reefs, the brachiopods and crinoids, this was an apocalypse. Their shells, the very cities of life, began to dissolve. The entire foundation of the marine ecosystem simply wasted away. But the acid was fast. The second killer was slow and far more patient. As the globe warmed, the oceans warmed with it. And warm water cannot hold oxygen. The planet's seas, from the surface to the depths, began to suffocate. The normal ocean currents, the conveyor belts that carry oxygen deep, they slowed. And then, researchers believe they stopped entirely. The ocean became stratified, a hot, breathless layer on top and a stagnant, toxic layer below. In that dark, oxygen-starved water, a new form of life thrived. Anaerobic bacteria, which don't breathe oxygen, but instead consume sulfate. And their waste product? A deadly, suffocating poison. Hydrogen sulfide. This toxic gas began to fill the deep ocean. It rose in massive, choking plumes. Poisoning everything it touched. The water itself became a weapon. Scientists call this the Canfield Ocean, a stagnant, purple, and profoundly toxic world. Any creature that wasn't dissolved by acid was now suffocated by heat. Or poisoned by this invisible gas. The trilobites, the sea scorpions, the great reef builders, all gone. Over 95% of all species in the sea vanished. The planet's vibrant, ancient ocean was now a silent, sterile, dead zone. The great dying was over. But the world did not recover. Not for 1 million years. Not for 3 million. Geological records show that for 5 million years, the Earth's oceans remained a stagnant, toxic, impossibly hot, dead zone. This is the greatest mystery of the Permian extinction. Not what killed the world, but why it took so long for life to come back. The planet was stuck in a lethal feedback loop. The Siberian Traps were still simmering, releasing CO2. This kept the planet hot and the oceans breathless. Without oxygen, the toxic bacteria ruled the depths. And on land, the acid rain had destroyed the soils. Without plants to hold it back, the land itself was bleeding into the sea. Torrents of silt, rock, and chemical nutrients washed into the coastlines. But these nutrients didn't feed new life. They only fed the anaerobic bacteria, strengthening the poisonous, suffocating cycle. The ocean was a locked trap. Nothing complex could evolve because the water was toxic. And the water stayed toxic because nothing complex was there to clean it. This was the crucible, a 5 million year war of attrition against an ocean that actively killed life. So, who was the survivor? Who was the hero that broke this cycle? There was no single animal. The savior wasn't a great beast. The survivor was a process, a return of the planet's biological pump. It started with the humblest of pioneers. Microscopic algae. Tiny, single-celled plankton. In isolated pockets of the surface ocean, perhaps fed by volcanic minerals. They began to do the one thing the toxic bacteria could not. They began to photosynthesize. They consumed the suffocating carbon dioxide. And they released the one thing the world desperately needed: oxygen. When these tiny pioneers died, they sank, taking their carbon with them to the ocean floor. For the first time, carbon was being scrubbed from the surface. This was the key. This simple act of sinking, it slowly, painfully, began to starve the toxic bacteria below. It cleared the water. It let sunlight penetrate deeper. It was the first gear turning in a machine that had been broken for 5 million years. This tiny pulse of oxygen was the lifeline. It created small, shallow sanctuaries near the surface. Habitable zones, where more complex life could finally get a foothold. The first animals to return were not impressive. They were disaster taxa, simple, hardy creatures that thrive in chaos. Things like small, bivalve-like mollusks and simple burrowing worms. They didn't look like heroes.
Don't judge a book by its cover.
But these creatures were the planet's cleanup crew. They filtered the mucky, nutrient-choked water. And more importantly, they burrowed into the poisoned sediment. This burrowing, an action called bioturbation, was revolutionary. It actively pumped the algae's precious oxygen down into the mud, neutralizing the toxic bacteria on the seafloor. This was the blueprint. The microscopic algae made the cure. The humble burrowers injected it. Together, they scrubbed the water and detoxified the seabed. Slowly, painfully, over thousands of generations, the Great Dead Zone began to shrink. The biological pump was restarted, and the planet's recovery finally, truly began. With the water clear and the poison gone, life exploded. The survivors of the Great Dying inherited an empty world, a blank slate. This cleared stage set the scene for the next great dynasty. The Triassic. The small, burrowing reptiles that survived on land. Would eventually give rise to the dinosaurs. And in the newly healed seas, new, fast-swimming marine reptiles appeared. The terrifying ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, rulers of the new ocean. The greatest catastrophe in history was also the greatest opportunity, a catastrophic opportunity that wiped the board clean. The Permian Extinction teaches us a profound lesson. That life is not just tenacious, it is a chemical force. It doesn't just endure the environment, it creates it. Survival is not always about the strong, but about the pioneers humble enough to restart a broken world. If you would like to join us on our next expedition into Earth's darkest hours in search of the light of life, consider joining our Researchers Guild by subscribing to the channel. And let us know in the comments. Which part of this 5 million year dead zone do you find the most terrifying or the most hopeful?